World, it's Lee Kelson coming to you from our FireTech Connect studio here in sunny Queensland, Australia. My guest today is a systems engineer, officially trained at the Australian National University in Canberra, and has spent some time on the trading floor in financial markets, working in both currency and commodities trading, liquidity, sales and asset management, and is the founder and CEO of a startup, Videotranslator.ai. And we are joined by Tat today. Tat, thanks for joining FireTech Connect.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I think you've just got back from quarantine in India.
That was an exciting set of circumstances, any ways you look at it. Would you like to hear the highlights?
I'd love to hear the highlights.
So oddly enough, actually, it worked out pretty well. I was in India in early March, scoping out clients, and I also have family there, so it was sort of a trip about that. And about a third of the way through, the lockdowns happened and quarantine ended up coming down. Now, at the time, I was at a yoga ashram selling them my product. I'm not making this up, by the way. They were using it for making videos on yoga exercises you could do, breathing exercises to increase your immunity or your resistance levels to COVID-19. So as places to be locked down, that was actually really good. It was open, it was wide, you could walk around, do everything. But yeah, it was an interesting 5 weeks there. Lost a little bit of weight because the food was, yoga ashram. But yeah, eventually got in touch with the High Commission. They were fantastic. The Australian High Commission, genuinely the work the men and women there have done, I'm hugely impressed with. I think it comes under DFAT or whatever it is.
Yeah.
I don't deal with them on a regular basis or whatever, so all I have is my experiences in this trip, and they were fantastic. They got us some passes, so I think it was Australian citizens, Canadian citizens, Singaporean citizens. We're going to Mumbai, Chennai, and Delhi, and from there flying to Doha, and then spreading around. And under very trying circumstances, we had multiple temperature checks and hotels and quarantine. But look, it isn't fun, and I would not recommend it. I was a little bit miffed that I got the Travel Lodge as opposed to the Hilton or the Intercontinental. But people they were absolutely fantastic. They'd call you every morning and mental health check, physical health check, nurses. It was very well organized. Whoever's running point on that is clearly, as an end user, that's all I can say. Yeah.
End user experience. Well, that's good. So you're safely back here now, and it is a crazy world that we live in. It's funny when you introduce guests and you say they've just come out of quarantine. But I seem to be doing that on a regular basis now.
What are you going to? The world we live in.
It's the world we live in. So I guess we met some time ago and we were talking about your Videotranslator.ai, and it's some really cool technology. But before we dive into that, maybe just give us a little bit more color on your background, and then tell us how you ended up in video translation.
Sure. I studied engineering at the ANU. I did that with a double in IT, which turned out to be quite fortuitous because, as it turned out, IT opened a lot more doors, so to speak. Finished 08, 09, moved down to Sydney. Canberra is just a little bit too cold. The weather there leaves a little bit to be desired. Joined State Street Bank and Trust, their global markets division here in Sydney, primarily in currencies and commodities. Spent 6-7 years in the electronic trading world. Of course, today it isn't called electronic trading, it's just all trading. But when I started, it was the electronic trading division within the global markets firm. It was an exceptionally exciting job. My job hasn't actually changed that much between moving from markets to moving to running a technology company. Even the people are the same. I'm not making that up. There was a lot of it was primarily looking at systems. You had distributed streams of information. That's what currencies and commodities are in the electronic trading world. And people reacting to that. It was an exciting time because, the growth of sort of post GFC, that was the really big shift towards electronic trading as banks tried to cut costs. And risk became a much bigger factor. So suddenly you wanted real-time updates on positions of whatever market counterparties you were dealing with. So largely the job involved dealing with technologists, dealing with clients, dealing with the markets in general.
Yeah.
Putting all that together. Really enjoyed that. Towards the end, there were a couple of options that were coming up. You did it for 6-7 years. You've sort of done it quite a bit. Look, the markets are a fantastic example of human cooperation, right? Like they're just unbelievable. So I learned a lot from those. Very lucky that people there are a lot nicer than they get a rep for, truth be told.
It depends what side of the market you're on, I guess.
Well, yeah, but as people go, it can be a stressful environment, so they do take care of others. But after that, moved into an opportunity came up to move to Germany. I ended up declining that, but one of the reasons was that State Street was expanding into continental Europe and the global markets business. But really simple things, right? That the collateral, a brochure, how-tos, if you need them in 5-10 languages, especially when it's electronic trading in that space, it became hugely complicated. You'd have to go to in-house counsel plus a panel of law firms in Frankfurt, and then do that again in the UK, which is where State Street Europe is headquartered, and then finally to the US. That entire process was ludicrously expensive, especially in legal terms, because first it's continental Europe's laws, which are exciting, and then the FSA, and then it was from those sort of discussions and understanding how hard it would be to sell a new kind of product into continental Europe that sort of the idea of translation came about. High complexity information in high stress points. How do you get that across? And so I got interested in translation, and then eventually quit and started this company that focused on AI translation, and a final pivot to videos off the back of videos continuing growth. But wow. Yeah.
And so how long have you been? When did you start the company?
In my head, I did a whole heap, and I paid some guys to build a prototype that didn't work, and I finally came to the conclusion that it was full time or not. So mid-end 2017 is when I hired a couple of guys and went from there. Yeah.
Right. And so tell us, particularly, I suppose, how we connected was through the fire tech, the use case in fire technologies. And one of the interesting things that I've discovered over the last few months is that whilst there's not a lot of companies that are, well, there are companies that are specifically focused in fire tech, but there's also a large amount of companies that are not necessarily focused in that space as a segment of the market, but have really cool use cases in that segment of the market. And I think, we talked about your use case in terms of fire technology. So perhaps you can sort of share that with us.
Absolutely. So I'll start with just the basic flow so people know what's happening. Our tech is pretty straightforward. It's an app. You can get on the website and give it a shot. Essentially, you log in, you upload a video, use an artificial intelligence to transcribe that video. Then, so you have the captions. Then you use a second artificial intelligence to translate the captions. And optionally a third one to speak out the captions in the target language. And that's how you translate video. So quite literally, we do video translation using AI. So we're Videotranslator.ai. It's fairly self-explanatory. Now that being the basic box of technically how it works, We work with a lot of healthcare type clients, and basically to make healthcare videos that go out to the general public. And off the back of some very convenient, very useful introductions at just here in Sydney at Fishburners, uh, ended up speaking to a lot of people in and around the emergency services, right? Of the bushfires were a very big deal, and that was a lot of the drivers. And emergency scenarios have very similar characteristics to what we do in health. I mean, COVID is a fantastic example. So while we're not in the fire tech space per se, uh, we have clients that are using our technology uh, to get emergency type information out to the public. And the entire use case is simply that, you have a lot of people from different parts of the world who might need the information. And using our technology, you can get it out to multiple languages at scale cheaply, basically, is the use case. So yeah, that's
Yeah.
how we got involved with the fire conversations.
So in the example where, during the bushfire crisis over the last summer, we saw daily press briefings, and typically you see the signer standing next doing the sign language, but it's all in English. So you could take that press briefing, translate that, caption it as well, I understand, and
Absolutely.
and transcribe that in what, 60 languages?
Absolutely. So it's 60 dialects, but it's about 150 languages or so.
Right.
Um, what the way you want to think about it is uh, the sign language, the ASL people who so often are with, when politicians or emergency people make statements to the media. A lot of that is a accessibility use case fundamentally, unless the content is accessible. If you're deaf, you can't really hear it. We think language is just a broader use case of that. So much like accessibility for deaf people, language for people who don't speak the language in question. So the question is, how do you get information out consistently, quickly? Uh, and I think getting it out across multiple languages is critical for governments these days, from tourism to uh, people, immigrants. There's a variety of use cases. How do you keep that consistent? How do you do that quickly? And how do you do that at scale? The quickly actually comes from video itself. Is one of the reasons why video has become so popular. The absolute ease of, putting things together and getting it out there quickly. But yeah, that was sort of where it started. And some of the conversations were around, it isn't enough to just have the sign language. What you want are often the captions, because you can add the captions into whatever social media you're pushing it out, right? So you might have a subtitles file, you might have an RSS feed, you might have it as XML. And that's absolutely critical for pretty much every tool that can then work on top of it, right? So if you have that information going out, other people can create tools that will use that information. So there's a very large search implication there. So
Right.
basically the win is accessibility on one side, but also search, right? So if you don't think in English, say you think in Chinese, you think in Tamil, what are the words you would use to find answers to these questions? And how do
Right.
you get that to them quickly? That's kind of the win.
Right. So it's interesting. Back in the late 90s, I guess it was, I was involved in a technology company. We were based out of the US, and I remember being introduced by one of our engineers to some of the early speech recognition software. And I remember trying to get it to work for about 20 minutes or so, getting it to recognize what I was saying. And it kept, it was the early Siri, right? And it was actually quite hilarious. Now, more recently with my work with Beach City, I've traveled around and done a lot of interviews, mainly throughout Asia, but also in Europe and the US. And we've used translation tools to do captioning and to translate in Thai and Chinese. And one of the interesting things there is that English is not English is not English. right? You have accents and you have nuances. And sometimes when we would use those auto captioning tools, particularly, it would just be gobbledygook. It was useless. And by the time you went through and edited it, it didn't make any sense. I mean, how do you get that that consistency and that rigor around this type of technology when you've got so many variables?
That's a interesting question. It's a really good question, and I think you're getting to the heart of sort of what people find a little bit mystifying about AI, and in terms of how it does its things. So I'll sort of answer it in two ways. One, from a user's perspective, we have a language dialect mapping. So we've got about, I think, 13 Englishes. We added Singlish a little while ago, so Singaporean English.
Right.
You know, there's 8 or 10 Spanishes, there's 7 or 8 Arabics. So my understanding is that Chilean Spanish is completely, as in radically different from Spanish, right? And there's obviously French Canadian and French.
Well, sorry, I think that to some extent there's Victorian, Western Australian, Queensland, and New South Wales dialects as well, isn't there?
I think it's actually really important, right? Because one of the tragedies of the modern world is we're losing a lot of languages. So this is really important to me. So in the case of India, it's hundreds of dialects, and an example. I'll give you an example that you might be familiar with, like languages like Breton, in Europe. Manx, Gaelic. This is sort of vital cultural heritage, right? And so we absolutely Thuringian and Bavarian is little. Why not? I mean, it adds such a level of richness to human experience. So I think that's in an ideal world, yes, and why not? I think that's fantastic. The second part, so there's, from users' perspective, there's that when you look at accuracy, right?
Yeah.
That you try and you pick the dialect, and that helps quite a bit. So something really hard to do is where you have 4 people speaking with 4 different dialects. That would be quite complicated. And you can actually watch the AI, right? It'll get used to one person's sort of accent, and then when it switches to the next person, it'll get the first bunch of words wrong, just because tone differences. So that's one aspect. I think the other aspect about it is how AI works as a general question. How are you going to address accuracy in that? I think divide and conquer. I think, right now we have these general purpose AIs, as in blah translation AI or transcription AI. I think that'll narrow down quite a bit. So you might have a English to German medical translation AI, right? So you start with the same basic AI, but then you train it on very specified corpuses, and that's how you have a certain level of accuracy. I think that's what will happen in the future, and because similar words are used for different things, especially in nomenclature. So when you talk about more complicated stuff, as you move up information complexity, you basically have this entire vocabulary that's specific to every field. And so how do you do that kind of thing? So I think you'll see a lot of that. You'll see a lot more narrow focused AIs. And then they get chained together to give you something, which is basically the approach we've taken, right? We're chaining 3 artificial intelligences together to do something pretty cool. Yep.
Yeah, and I think one of the limitations I've seen emerge over the last few years with artificial intelligence is is data, the quantum of data required, really. And I also find that there's a lot of confusion when people, they interchange machine learning with AI, and I think there's a lot of misinformation about what artificial intelligence and machine learning. For those that are confused by that or not quite sure what those terms are, is there a simple way that you can explain that and the relationship between the two?
I can tell you how I look at it. There's basically 3 aspects of what collectively is called AI. One is machine learning, the other is big data, and the third is big compute. So machine learning, big data, and big compute are sort of the 3 subcomponents that together make up AI. Now, somewhat paradoxically, machine learning is the sounds the sexiest, is easiest to use, so sometimes it's used interchangeably with AI. But for the purposes of thinking about it, AI is the meta or the big one, and machine learning, big data, and big computer, the middle bit, are what make it up. Big data is the easiest to explain because the last 10 years or so, we've now got the ability to store vast amounts of data. We can also envisage applications that use vast amounts of data, right? So 20 years ago, you just couldn't store this much information. So it'd be pointless to have applications. So that's big data. And we're talking genuinely vast amounts of data, right? On every data point you can have. So that's one aspect of it. The second is big compute. And it has a lot to do with sort of the slowness that we've all seen in getting to 10 nanometer chips, right? So 8, 10 nanometer chips aren't that popular, and it's taken a lot longer. So if you look at the speed of the decline, of the reduction in the transistor sizes over the last 15, 20 years, we were making really big jumps, and now we've sort of got your 10 nanometer and we've sort of stopped there. What's happening is there's a lot of research going on in optimizing architectures more than just let's go for smaller. And that's had remarkable changes in how computing works. So throughput of computers is absolutely exponential at the moment, right? Like the amount of stuff we can shove through our chips in terms of processing power. So that's big compute, right? That's the technical reason. Practically speaking, computers have gotten ridiculously fast compared to what they used to be, right? So those are two really big sort of reasons that aren't talked about as much. But in that context, you now have machine learning. What are we doing with machine learning? This is not a great answer. It's just how I understand it. Think about an Excel spreadsheet, right? You've got 2 or 3 sheets and you have VLOOKUP functions across them. Now, in that Excel spreadsheet, if I move one of the cells on spreadsheet 1, the VLOOKUP is going to fail because it no longer knows what to do, right? Now, because of big data and big compute, that no longer matters. So we can, example, spend time looking around spreadsheet 1 to where I've moved it, right? And the function will still work. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Very rudimentary level? Right.
Yeah.
Now imagine that same case, but now instead of a 100 row by 100 row, I have 1,000,000 rows by 1,000,000 rows. So that's big data, right? So the first one was big compute. We could just scan around a lot quicker. Now with big data, it's become much bigger, right? And the specific thing we're doing with machine learning, and you should definitely talk to a mathematician to understand this with, outside of this is how a layperson thinks about it, is instead of doing sort of cell level comparisons, what we're doing is, because we've got so much data, we create effectively multidimensional visualizations of it, and then use the AI to find commonalities from a geometry perspective. So blob data looks like a cube, blob data that's somewhere else also looks like a cube. Hey, that's a solution.
Right.
Right.
So it is the sort of the ability for sort of almost a continuous variation. It's a bit like sort of, as you were speaking, I was thinking it's a bit like a virus that has the ability to mutate and change its shape, or it's not like the old static, the way we were writing code back in the mid-90s, where it's static and there it is, and then you have to go in and manually change it. It's sort of the ability.
To some extent, because what's happening is, think about us doing that at a very simple level. If I have an X and a Y, I can turn that into a shape of a graph, right? I can graph that in some fashion. I can look at it in some statistical way. And now I have insight that I didn't have earlier. If you could real time do that in hundreds of dimensions, you're basically looking at the geometry of the underlying data. And that's how the AIs are jumping to solutions that are totally non-obvious to us.
Right.
Right. It's fundamentally like that, if you draw a function out, it tells you a lot more. You can tell if it's going up or going down. This is why we use statistics and business intelligence tools of every variety. It's basically that ability, but across hundreds of dimensions, and that makes the big difference. But what we're doing is, and again, you should talk to a mathematician about it, but we're looking at the shape of the data and making comparisons between the shapes of different blobs of data, and therefore finding linkages that we couldn't find, when we sort of think it through, so to speak. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And so how would that relate to people in day-to-day life when they're, traveling the web and there's data being collected on them? And then, for example, it's served up in very specific ways that they are maybe interested in, or how many times have we, gone on and looked at some website and then got onto Facebook and 10 minutes later, we've been served something very specific. And I think, one of the big things about Google that made it unique when it first launched was the relevancy, and it's still to this day protects its relevancy. The idea that when we used to search for things, we would get whatever happened to be slammed into the metadata, right? And people could easily manipulate that. And then the idea of relevancy was, it's got to have backlinks and it's got to have sources pointing to it, and it's got to have a whole raft of criteria. But then it's continuing to learn that about you. So we are seeing some of those applications in that type of a consumer scenario, are we not?
I think we absolutely are. Two aspects to it. The first is, as a general statement, it means our tools will get a little bit smarter, right? So you'll have all these, super focused on this one thing AI that's embedded into whatever widget you're using, and our tools are going to get a lot bigger, right? So I think that's one part of it. I think the other part of it is also that, our society and community has a legitimate interest in understanding how these things work, has a legitimate interest in understanding how these things are policed and used for things that matter to us. So I think those are both very valid points that I don't subscribe to the more exciting visions of what might come to pass. I think I think the lack of any specificity around that means that people don't know what they're talking about. But in terms of the tools we have, they'll absolutely get a bunch better. They'll, they're looking at drones that sort of can know where you are as a person and sort of fly around you, and they follow you around like a little dog. That kind of thing there's a lot more of that that's going to happen. But I think largely it's going to be better tools is the way I think about it.
Yeah. I think the other thing is that, it's one of these buzz terms that we've seen in technology over the years, that all of a sudden you slam .ai onto the end of your domain name or whatever, or, put it into your pitch deck. It comes up everywhere. I know I've been pitched a few times and I've sort of said, so what's the AI component here? And, there's just been really nothing there. And we saw it with the .com period. We saw it with the early SaaS and cloud. If it's cool, stick it in your deck. And, so it sort of, dilutes the currency, doesn't it, really, in a way, of what it actually is and what it really means.
It does. You're 100% right, but it's also a function of the ecosystem, isn't it? It's kind of how our industry works. And there's many different ways of looking at it. Is it necessarily a bad thing? I don't know, but 100%. You've changed the meaning of it to mean a more generic term. It's now it's a thing in the mimetic landscape, right? It's no longer what it actually means. So yeah, I mean, but that's just part of the game. I think that the words change, and
they do.
We see this with pretty much everything, right? Like it's the big thing yesterday is no longer the big thing tomorrow, and that's part of the business cycle in VC is
the next shiny thing, that's for sure. Yeah. So what's next for Video Translator?
So we're doing a bunch of fairly interesting things. Actually, we're setting up an office in India, which will be really good. There's a lot of demand. In Australia, we were originally sort of aimed, your tourism, healthcare, that kind of thing. Tourism we'll have to see how it goes, but within the Anglosphere, if I may, I'm using this in a very expansive sense. I think our product is a nice to have. Whereas if you look at places like India or Europe, just because they've got so many more languages, or even big economies, big export economies like Japan or Korea or Germany, it's sort of a must-have because they need to get their products into the Anglosphere. It's a bigger market. So that's sort of where we're going along this. But it's an extraordinarily interesting time in video and in AI and it's. I think being nimble and not taking too many risks is going to pay off for small tech companies at this point in time. I mean, it's just the reality of it.
I think so. I think you're right. And those that can seek out those opportunities in other markets, you know, I know from my own experience in creating a lot of video in Asia, the translation and the captioning in other languages, or even recording in the language and then translating into English, particularly when you've got so many languages within the Asian region. It is one big region after all, and it's very interconnected. Whereas in Australia, you know, the first language, I guess, is English. But my experience over the last 30 years in technology, Tad, I can tell you, is that typically you have to go overseas to get traction on some of this new stuff before you can bring it back home. It's just the way it is. You know, Australia's a great market for testing and for iterating and developing your product. But I think if you really want to, well, I think it's fairly generally known. If you want to go to markets of scale, it's Europe, countries like Germany, North America. That's where the markets of scale, and throughout Asia and India, right?
100%. I think you have to go where you're needed, you know, at a very simple level. And we do stuff in language. India is a great market because they've got so many languages. It's also, and I think people are fully legitimate in this, right? And that they want content in their language. You know, it raises a really interesting question. Sort of, it's not a very polite question, but you know, when you think about it, I mean, if you would ask, what is wrong with everyone speaking just English, right? Because wouldn't that make things so much simpler? Not suggesting that's what I'm saying, but as a intellectual exercise, the answer is that's probably not a great idea, because most languages have a whole heap of words that are specific to the requirements of the people who came up with those words. You know, that's culture at the end of the day. So having more languages is better, and shopping it around and moving it from culture A to culture B, I think is going to be a really big part of finding economic growth, right? Because you basically look around and go, hey, who has a better idea at fixing this problem I have, right? Let me try and iterate on that. So I think that's going to be, and I think people understand that. You know, people absolutely get that. They get civic society and the government in India, and I think in Europe also understands that for economic growth to deliver, to get products at scale, to expand markets, you need to have this thing happen. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of, despite all the doom and gloom, I think a lot of really interesting things that are happening.
No, I agree. There is a lot of interesting things, and you know, I think out of every crisis, there are an abundance of opportunities. It depends on the lens that you look at it through. Some, you know, it's in, I suppose it's human nature to look at it and say, well, you know, what have I lost, and how to, you know, all these things that I had. But I think the entrepreneurial mindset is to very quickly shift from that into what have we got that we can leverage, where can we pivot to, what markets are, you know, have a need for the product that we've got and the problem that we're solving. But I'd wrap that up by saying, you know, to sort of take away those cultural nuances from around the world with these unique languages and things. I think, you know, I would hate to see a world where that was the case, that everybody spoke English.
Absolutely.
You know,
absolutely. Because there's so many exciting and interesting words, you know, that you realize is different ways of looking at things, different cultural phenomena that are useful. I mean, at the end of the day, if you can get some of that moving back and forth. I mean, look at the growth of YouTube, right? That's basically what we're talking about. So I think for organizations, and I have this sort of conversation quite a bit with the client, you're familiar with Google Ads, right?
Yeah.
Do you know the keyword planner function in that?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so basically that, right? Fantastic tool, by the way. So you just put in whatever word you're looking for, and then you do a search. So it'll go, in
Yeah.
Australia, this word was searched this many times. But it's all the other words is what else did people speak about? And I think the game is going to be, what are the words my clients or my prospects think about this problem with, and how to position my product into that, right? So
Yeah.
that's how I think that's the kind of conversation we have with a lot of our clients in terms of, how do you actually make this thing happen? Someone can't buy your product if they don't know why they would want to buy your
Right.
product. Yeah, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
but I think that's not just a product thing anymore. I think governments get that. I think emergency services get that. They have to get the information out. I was doing a little sort of, your pre-disaster, post-disaster. It's all about going, big part of it is what's our public awareness level, right? And, that sets the stage for everything. So if you can
Yeah.
sort of structurally set that up to be tilted in your favor, so I think that's really exciting, especially since COVID also, the level of awareness in public health has gone through the roof, as you'd imagine. And so it's lots of really interesting ideas and questions. Yeah.
Interesting space, Tat. So, look, thank you very much for joining us today. It's been great having a chat with you. I'm happy to see you back in the country and you're out of quarantine and you're back on deck. And we'll look forward to keeping in touch and catching up with you in the near future.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Lee. It was a pleasure.
Thanks, mate.